Welcome back to Gluten-Free RN. This is episode 19. I'm Nadine, and today we're going to talk about legal issues related to celiac disease. This is going to be another fascinating topic, so join me as we talk about some of the legal issues surrounding celiac disease. Hi, and welcome back to Gluten-Free RN podcast. I'm Nadine Gruskowiak, RN, BSN, CEN, Certified Emergency Room Nurse, in my past life, 10 years ago. I've been a gluten-free RN for 10 years now. I'm very proud of that accomplishment and that anniversary. And over those 10 years, I have learned a lot about the legal issues regarding celiac disease and surrounding celiac disease. So today in episode 19, we're going to talk about that. I also wanted to recognize that there are people all over the world that are listening to this podcast. And that's another thing I'm very excited about. It's extremely important that people understand that celiac disease is a worldwide issue. And I am very proud to bring this information to people all over the world that may benefit from it. Well, I'm going to speak today about legal issues in the United States. This may or may not apply to where you live, and there's a number of reasons for that. One, because many industrialized countries in the world have universal health care, where all of the citizens are covered for health care benefits. That is not the case in the United States, where we have healthcare for profit. So typically, healthcare is purchased through an employer, or you get as a benefit your healthcare insurance through an employer or your job. So if you don't have a job, or you're self-employed, or you lost your job, a lot of people lose their healthcare insurance. Thankfully, the Affordable Care Act actually now covers many, many more people, millions more people, but it's still an insurance-based health insurance, for-profit healthcare. And I've been a huge advocate of single-payer healthcare for a number of years, going back to my emergency department days, because we have to realize as Americans, we pay regardless. We cover everybody regardless. If you show up at the emergency department, you will be seen. And healthcare is very expensive in the United States. However, our healthcare outcome does not reflect that. So we have a very high cost for healthcare, but not a very good healthcare outcome. How does that relate to celiac disease? Well, in other countries where it is a single-payer system, a lot of people are getting tested for celiac disease very quickly. In Italy, it takes 2 to 3 weeks to get diagnosed with celiac disease because they do have a universal healthcare system. And then all of their follow-up care is covered. It's very standardized, and people are taken care of because food is medicine, and the Italian government decided that it's much cheaper to treat people appropriately, and it costs the government much less money the sooner people are diagnosed with celiac disease and put on a gluten-free diet. So here in the United States, where it is a for-profit healthcare system, it takes on average of 9 to 15 years to get a diagnosis of celiac disease. During the rest of that time, people get many other tests. They may get misdiagnosed with other things, or they may be put on medications for other things that may or may not help them, and sometimes actually make them worse. So the advantage of a single-payer healthcare system is that hopefully physicians, number one, would be educated about celiac disease. People would get tested appropriately, and then the follow-up care would be standardized. I did find out that Canada is pretty good at diagnosing celiac disease, but they're not very good at follow-up based on a lot of the questions that I see on the Canadian celiac disease websites and Facebook pages and whatnot. So while I used to think that Canada was extremely good about celiac disease, what I now understand is that they're very good at diagnosing celiac disease, but not so great at the follow-up. So we all have work to do. I would say that most countries of the world have a lot of work to do in regards to celiac disease. It is the largest untapped market in the world, and we have to actually approach it so that patients are benefiting from that information as opposed to being punished for it, and diagnoses are delayed. We really have to make sure that people are diagnosed appropriately and quickly so that they can increase the quality of life and also reap the benefits of health by being on a gluten-free diet, at least if not a paleo type diet or a whole food diet. So I talk a lot about practitioners not paying attention to celiac disease or pretending it doesn't exist, or actually saying, hey, I don't believe in celiac disease. And to them, I always say, well, celiac disease is actually not a religion. I don't care if you believe in it or not. It's a documented, very well-researched medical issue where people can't digest the proteins in wheat, barley, rye, and oats. Sometimes oats being the typically cross-contaminated, but many of us still cannot eat oats, regardless if they're cross-contaminated or not. Guess what the United States and Canada grows a lot of? It happens to be wheat and other grains. So there'll have to be a huge paradigm shift in our agricultural community, our food industry, our healthcare industry, and how we approach all of these things if we're going to see significant change in people's health. And I used to be a nurse in the emergency department all over the state of Oregon and happily did that. I was unaware of celiac disease, and I will say that. So probably a lot of the patients that we saw in the emergency department for migraine headaches, abdominal pain of unknown etiology, neurological disorders, abdominal pain, fevers of unknown origin, neurological disorders such as headaches or difficulty balancing or difficulty walking due to balance issues. A lot of those patients we probably missed in the emergency department. I learned this way back when I went to the University of Buffalo when I still lived in New York. I grew up in Buffalo, New York, so I went to the University of Buffalo for a period of time, and I took a bunch of law classes. That was my main interest at the time. And one of the things I remember very clearly from those classes, from my professors, is that ignorance or not being aware of a law is not a defense. Like you can't say, well, officer, I didn't know that I couldn't make a left-hand turn on a red light. That's not a defense. You're still guilty if that's what you do. So the same thing applies to medical professionals or practitioners. It's our job to know about celiac disease and new research. Unfortunately, I've offered to give many classes to a lot of healthcare providers, and some of the doctors have actually said things like, you know what, I don't need to learn another thing, or why would I look for or diagnose celiac disease? That diet is so hard. My patients would never do it. Or again, I don't believe in celiac disease. I don't believe it exists. Can't do that. Celiac disease is, again, very well researched, very well documented in all the scientific journals all over the world. So you cannot pretend it doesn't exist. Because if you do, and you don't treat people appropriately, that's known as malpractice. And I really would love to prevent people from being sued for malpractice by making sure that they understand what celiac disease is, how to diagnose it appropriately and quickly, and how to do follow-up, because all of those areas are very important to know about as a practitioner. So if you work in an office that doesn't know very much about celiac disease or in a hospital, please consider having me or someone like me come in to do a class on celiac disease for healthcare providers. I promise it will be a research-packed lecture, and you will leave with information that is extremely useful. Dr. Marsh, who is the same doctor that actually came up with the classification system for celiac disease, Marsh 1, 2, 3, and 4, and there's some subsets in there for diagnosing. He has actually said that if doctors don't recognize or test appropriately or treat appropriately celiac disease patients, then, really they're up for malpractice liability. So it's extremely important that practitioners, whether you're a doctor, a nurse practitioner, a DO, a naturopath, however you practice, that you are in fact very aware and very cognizant of the signs and symptoms, and that celiac disease is pretty much on your differential diagnosis at all times for just about everyone. And I used to say it should be on the differential diagnosis for everyone, except for people with maybe hangnails. And I don't say that anymore because hangnails are actually caused by a deficiency and could be a sign or symptom of celiac disease. I know that sounds ridiculous to some practitioners, but the reality is that celiac disease shows up in so many ways because of the damage to the small intestine and because of the damage to the neurological system, that the intestinal damage can cause malabsorption of nutrients, and from that, a cascade of signs and symptoms. So again, we really do want to have celiac disease very prominently on our differential diagnosis. I, as a nurse, don't have so much to worry about differential diagnoses, but as a nurse, I also know that my patients should be. I know that many patients come in and tell me that it's been years that they've been going to see the same physician or multiple physicians, and they've never heard the term celiac disease or been tested for it, despite having many of the common signs or symptoms associated with celiac disease. So again, these people that it takes 9 to 15 years to get diagnosed with celiac disease have seen multiple doctors, and it's not been on their radar. So I'm hoping that this talk about the legal issues related to celiac disease will help actually prompt practitioners to get some information, to get educated, to read some research articles, or have myself or someone that is an expert in celiac disease come in and give a lecture. It can save you being sued or time or embarrassment with your patients. And I always recommend that doctors that are not familiar with the testing actually call me or call the lab. Don't be afraid to order the lab test if you don't know how to interpret it. Just run those tests and I will happily review them with you, or have someone that you know that is an expert in celiac disease review those tests with you so that people are not being missed. That's another issue. Several people have been tested for celiac disease, but then those tests are interpreted incorrectly, and those people continue to suffer for years before those tests are reviewed again. And in fact, celiac disease should have been the diagnosis, or they should have been referred for a endoscopy for biopsy. And when those things don't happen in the appropriate order, then those practitioners are opening themselves up for malpractice. So if we all remember, there was a lot of information, false information actually, that fat was bad for us in the medical journals and sugar was fine and carbohydrates don't impact our blood sugar. There's lots of false information in the medical journals, and I completely have been duped myself. And I had no idea that, gluten intolerance was an issue as a nurse. I didn't know celiac disease was an issue. It was not an issue for 70 years in the United States, but now it's coming out that it's a huge issue and it's actually a public health crisis. So we do, as practitioners, have to pay attention to it. We can't pretend it doesn't exist. So use your critical thinking skills as a practitioner. And even if you have to go back and test every patient in your practice for celiac disease, I think that's a good practice. I would highly recommend that you take that on. You test every patient that you have for celiac disease, because the NIH in 2004 actually convened a group of people and talked about doing a mass screening in the United States for celiac disease. And in Italy, every child is tested by age 6 for celiac disease because it's so prevalent in Italy. And they want to find people early because it's preventative for so many other health issues. So one test for celiac disease does not rule out a person. A person can actually develop celiac disease at any age with any symptom or no symptom, and certainly any ethnicity. This is a worldwide issue, and every ethnicity is actually affected. So anybody that has the DQ2 or DQ8 gene is predisposed for celiac disease proper, but then we also have to take into account that non-celiac gluten sensitivity exists. It's a real entity. It is a little bit more difficult to test for it, but the AGA or anti-gliadin antibody is a very good indicator that a person's body does not like the gliadin protein or the gluten protein. So find a lab that actually includes the AGA or anti-gliadin antibody. You may have to order that separately, but please include it for people, especially that may not carry the HLA DQ2 or DQ8 gene. I could tell you story after story after story of people that had been missed for many, many, many years with mental health issues, neurological disorders, seizure disorders, balance issues, abdominal issues, incorrectly diagnosed with Crohn's or colitis, that suffered with hemorrhoids or GERD, high blood pressure. They actually experienced heart attacks and strokes and cancers and all kinds of things, and come to find out they actually have celiac disease. But they had to go through all of these other medical calamities sometimes and survive them to then find out that celiac disease potentially was the underlying issue. Another common problem that I hear of fairly often is that patients are diagnosed with celiac disease through a blood test and a intestinal biopsy. Then they go on a gluten-free diet and they do very well. During the follow-up lab test, the doctor might order another celiac panel to see where the patient is, how their health is improving on a gluten-free diet. Unfortunately, sometimes because the antibodies go down into normal range, some of these people are being told that they no longer have celiac disease or they were cured from celiac disease. But the reality is that if a person is on a gluten-free diet, those antibodies should be disappearing and they should be a normal range. It means that a person is doing a great job on a gluten-free diet and their body is recovering and healing. The legal problem here is that if a patient is told that they no longer have celiac disease or they were cured, or that the initial test was a false positive, but the patient really has celiac disease and goes back to eating gluten, that patient can suffer from irreparable damage. And that means that they could slide into what's known as RCD, or refractory celiac disease, which equates to lymphoma. And the doctors will tell patients that this is not curable, it is only treatable, and typically with medications. So it's past the point where a gluten-free diet will help anymore. So this is one reason I never, ever recommend that people that have started a gluten-free diet ever go back to eating gluten. Because if they are celiac, then once they are continuing to get gluten again, because their doctor told them they were cured or they didn't have celiac disease to begin with, then the damage still happens. Even with a breadcrumb, remember, intestinal villi can get destroyed and your immune system can get destroyed. And you also have inflammation. So it causes organ damage. So if a doctor is telling a patient that has been diagnosed with celiac disease that they don't have celiac disease anymore, can you imagine what a legal issue that would be if that patient ended up with damage that can't be repaired or dying? This is a heavy topic to cover, but I really think that somebody has to talk about it because I hear about it, I see it in the literature, but I really don't hear that many people talking about it. And it's very important that we all talk about it. 1, so that everybody can be on the same page. 2, so that maybe the United States and other countries will get standardization as far as who gets tested, how often, when they get tested, how they get tested, are they tested correctly, and how they get followed up. Because it's very important that practitioners actually know how to follow up a patient that has been diagnosed with celiac disease. One of my lovely patients, a gentleman in his 70s, was diagnosed with celiac disease by biopsy several years ago, way before he came into my office, and nobody had done any follow-up on him. His primary care doctor didn't follow up on it, and the doctor that originally had diagnosed him with the biopsy moved away. So all of his records, who knows where they went. And so when he came into my office, he was having significant neurological issues. He had gluten ataxia, he was falling, and all kinds of issues were going on for him. So he was in my office looking for advice on how to follow up. So I gave him the recommended lab test sheet that I have mentioned in previous podcasts. I gave that to him to take to his primary care provider to order those tests so that we could get him on a appropriate diet and healing. He went to see his primary care doctor, who essentially yelled at him and told him he wasn't going to order the test and he didn't have celiac disease, and it just went on and on. So this lovely 70-year-old gentleman came into my office in tears that the doctor made him feel really bad and he didn't want to go back there anymore, and he was looking for a new doctor, and what should he do? So I ended up calling the doctor's office, of course, and making sure that that doctor knew that those tests were actually the standard lab work that needed to be ordered for anybody diagnosed with celiac disease. And we did find that patient another doctor, but can you imagine that doctor is actually culpable for my patient's neurological damage? My lovely man is not going to sue his former primary care provider, but he certainly has grounds for a malpractice suit. The information was there. It should have been followed up on. It never was. And my patient potentially, even though he is recovering, he did suffer years with neurological damage and falling and many, many other issues, despite his initial diagnosis for celiac disease. As a nurse, I'm very concerned about public health care issues and celiac disease in particular. 1, because I have it and went 40 years without finding out that I had it. And I myself had seen multiple doctors and paid probably thousands of dollars out of pocket without finding out the real answer until I was 40 years old and had multi-system organ failure. So if I can help anybody, whether it's practitioners practice better or patients ask the right questions or advise people about follow-up, I will happily do it. So hopefully this information is going to help people worldwide get better quicker with much less suffering and without all of the potential legal issues that could come out of this. As a nurse, I'm also interested in the celiac community being very active for a single payer or universal coverage healthcare plan system for the United States. So I would like to challenge all of the people in the United States that have been diagnosed with celiac disease for pushing and advocating for a single payer healthcare system. I myself am a member of the PNHP, which is Physicians for a National Health Plan. Also, Healthcare for All. In my state of Oregon, it's Healthcare for All Oregon. I'm also a member of the Mid-Valley Healthcare Alliance. I've given testimony in front of the state legislature subcommittee to advocate for single-payer. Please consider being very vocal about getting single-payer healthcare system, because the insurance companies, while they know they spend less money the sooner that people get diagnosed with celiac disease, we live in a for-profit healthcare system. Think about that for a little bit. There truly is no benefit for our for-profit healthcare system to diagnose celiac disease early. That's one of the reasons that many people actually have to go on average of 7 to 15 years for a diagnosis of celiac disease. During that time, a lot of people get multiple tests and see their multiple doctors and specialists without truly getting a diagnosis of celiac disease, which tends to be the underlying issue or the underlying cause of many of their signs and symptoms. Universal healthcare systems, such as in Italy and the UK and Canada, realize that there is significant financial benefit for those systems to recognize a person with celiac disease early and get them diagnosed and put them on a gluten-free diet. I know I see doctors much less, if at all, now that I'm on a gluten-free diet. And that's horrible to say, but it's the truth. And I will also tell people, and I've told my kids this for years, there's no excuse for bad behavior. And that goes for practitioners, and it also goes for us as people with celiac disease. Please don't use celiac disease as an excuse for bad behavior. I don't care what that is. It just reflects poorly back on the celiac community. So don't use celiac disease as an excuse for a parking ticket that you got, and don't use celiac disease as an excuse for bad behavior in a restaurant. There really is no call for that, and I won't be able to back you up. No bad behavior, okay? So this is Nadine Griskowiak, the Gluten-Free RN, wrapping up episode 19, talking about legal issues related to celiac disease. Hopefully this has been interesting and useful for you both as a patient and potentially as a practitioner. If you have any questions, I am readily available to answer them. I would also like to thank Tim Hallowell of The Podcasting Guy for being my executive producer and editor of the Gluten-Free RN podcast. And a huge shout out to Pulse Media Network, a community of healthcare providers that are podcasters themselves. My good friends Elizabeth, Keith, and Kevin, hello, and thank you very much for all of your support. As I wrap up episode 19 of the Gluten-Free RN podcast, thank you very much for listening wherever you are in the world, whether it's in Iran or Turkey or in Australia or the UK, the United States, or Canada. We have listeners all over the world, and I am so happy that you found the Gluten-Free RN podcast, and I hope you are benefiting. If you like this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or wherever you listen. And if you have any questions or suggestions for topics, just get that information to me, and I will investigate and look into things so that I can bring you a information-packed podcast, however long it lasts. We don't really have a set time yet. But every Friday at 9 a.m., the new podcast is released for that week. Something to look forward to, I hope. And until next episode, this is Nadine Griskowiak, Gluten-Free RN, signing out.